Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Today we're going to paint a snow scene. First, lightly draw out the major shapes. Determine the sections for foreground, midground, and background. No need to draw all the branches of the tree, just mark out the position of the tree. And draw out the trunk and some big branches to give yourself some guidelines. Draw shapes, but not objects. I chose this reference photo because it kinda already washed out the details. So focus on tonal values instead of trying to figure out what is what. The shadow on the snow is middle value, but don't make the pencil lines for the shadows too dark, as they might show through the watercolor. Use a kneaded eraser to remove excess graphite. For this painting, I'm using a damp sponge to wet both sides of the paper. This way the paper is damp but not wet. It will be damp enough for everything to be a bit fuzzy in the first wash, but the paint won't be flowing in all directions when I go in wetting wet. To achieve this effect, squeeze out excess water after you dip it in water. Make sure you thoroughly wet all corners so that the paper can stick to the board. For blue, I'm using the Ultramarine Blue from CheapJoe. The one in my palette is French Ultramarine. Ultramarine Blue is cooler than French Ultramarine, so I find it better for painting the shadow on snow. I'm pre-mixing some colors on my palette now. For red, I'm using Alizarin Crimson. And for yellow, I'm using Indian Yellow. For the white snow on the ground, I'm actually using diluted Indian Yellow to show its color under the sun. Indian Yellow is a warm yellow, so it will constitute a contrast to the cold Ultramarine Blue. I'm literally using it all over the foreground. You can go over the rocks because they have a yellowish undertone. To make it not too flat and boring, I added a little bit Alizarin Crimson onto the paper to make some spots a bit warmer. I'm adding a bit Alizarin Crimson into Ultramarine Blue. The mixture is very watery, and I'm blocking in some shadow area on the snow. I'm using a clean damp brush to lift off some paint, so there's some variation in the first wash. Now I'm using pure Ultramarine Blue to keep blocking in the shaded areas. I'm using Indian yellow for the sunlit grass. Let the paints blend on paper when they touch. You can drop Indian yellow to the blue on paper. Now moving on to the sky. I'm picking up some leftover Alizarin Crimson on the palette and add it to Indian yellow to make it a bit warmer to paint the clouds. As you can see, this is very watery. In this way, I'm giving the clouds a bit warm undertone and at the same time make the paper wetter so that when I paint the sky, the paint can flow better. For the sky, I'm using a very watery mixture of Ultramarine Blue and Alizarin Crimson. The focus of the painting is the snow field and the shadows, so I don't want the skies to compete with that. The pale bluish wash helped wet the paper, so now I can introduce darker mixture to achieve a smoother blend. I'm adding more details to the hilltop while it is still wet. I'm picking up the pigment from the palette without adding any water because I want color to be saturated enough. Now I'm mixing a dark green using Indian yellow and ultramarine blue. The mixture is quite thick as the sky is very wet. I'm painting the distant trees. As you can see, the pigments get diluted once on paper, so I'm mixing a darker mixture with less water and more pigments. Some white spots left unpainted are a bit harsh, so I'm using a clean damp brush to soften it. Now I'm making a bluish gray using the 3 colors. The consistency is very thick. And I'm using it to paint the distant mountains. Make sure the mountains are not too dark. Paler and cooler things recede visually. But also be aware that the sky is very wet, so the mixture for the distant mountains can be wet. Intensify certain areas as you see fit, so that the mountains are not just one flat shape. Oops. Don't panic if accidents like this happen. I will not rush to rescue it right now. I will add darker details to the shaded area of the hilltop anyway. So right now, I just want to finish the distant mountains. If you can get the value right in one go, that's of course much better. But as long as you pay attention to the dampness of the paint, you can always gradually build it up to the right tonal values when it's still damp. As we are using 3 primary colors to mix this dark color, you can vary the ratios of the 3 pigments to get different shades of gray, so that there are subtle changes within the mountains. Now I'm blending the accidental drop of color into the shadows. The paper is still damp, so I'm going to paint the shadows wetting wet. I'm using pure Ultramarine Blue in a rather thick consistency. Painting the shadows wetting wet helps to create that soft, fuzzy effect. You can go over everything in shadow, including those parts of rocks. I'm tilting the brush to use its entire length to paint this wider but lighter shadow. I'm just lightly brushing over the paper. Deepen certain parts when the paper is damp so it shows natural gradation. Now I'm making a brownish mixture using Indian yellow and Alizarin crimson to paint the rocks. Now I'm using the same color to add darker colors to the midground. Picking up some dark color left on the palette and adding more ultramarine blue. I'm using this dark color for the darkest part in the shadow. The texture should be quite dry, like straight out of the tube. Here again, we're painting shapes, not objects. Especially, it is almost impossible to tell what exactly are in the shadows. Always squint your eyes to remove unnecessary details in the reference photo. If you see the paint gets diluted easily once laid on paper, then make sure there is no excess water in your brush. And do not introduce any water into the pigment. There are some leftover paints from my previous projects. They are burnt umber and the Lunar Black. I don't like wasting things, so I'm reusing these. It doesn't mean you have to use these two colors. They just happen to be on my palette. You can use burnt umber, burnt sienna, or sepia to mix with ultramarine blue to make a rich black color. Or to stick to the limited palette, mix the three colors in a thick mixture to make an almost black color. The burnt umber I introduced earlier is useful here for painting the shaded parts of the rocks. By adding shadows and darkening the shaded sides, the rocks will become 3D. For color harmony, when introducing a new color, try to incorporate it somewhere else in the painting, unless you are using it as a highlight color to stand out on its own. As the paper slowly dries, assess whether anything needs to be darker. Now I see some of the shadows needs to be darker. The trees also need to be a bit darker in the shadow area, so I'm picking up the green color left on the palette. Since now it is drier than before, it will be darker. You can also use the complementary color of green to darken it. This dark mixture has Alizarin Crimson in it. Or you can directly use Alizarin Crimson. I'm using a small synthetic brush to darken some small details. The one I use happens to be an angular shaped brush, but you can use other small size synthetic brushes. The paper is getting drier. At this stage, you have to be very careful not to introduce excess water. Synthetic brushes are less absorbent. That's why I'm switching to a synthetic brush. As you can see, the brush is quite dry. I'm switching to a larger synthetic round brush and pick up some of the dark mixture and keep adding darker details. I'm using a larger size because I'm moving on to larger areas of dark value. Always use the largest size possible to avoid filling in an area with too many brush strokes. Up the same dark mixture, and I am moving on to the mid ground. Laying the brush a bit flat to use the body of the brush to create some dry brush textures. I'm switching to a Chinese calligraphy brush for different textures. As you might be able to see, the Chinese calligraphy brush's hair can be splayed and stay that way. I find it very useful for some details of animal hair or grass. Experiment with the brushes you already have to see the different kinds of marks they can make before rushing to buy more brushes. Now I'm adding a bit more Indian yellow to the dark mixture, so there is some variation in hues. Now wait for the paper to dry, and this might take some time. I'm using a clean, damp synthetic brush to soften some white space left unpainted earlier, and wipe off with tissue paper. Now that the paper is dry, I can see some shadows are too pale. So I'm re-wetting the paper in order to correct the tonal values without leaving harsh edges. I'm still using the same colors, Ultramarine Blue for the shadow. Wetting one side of the paper is different from wetting two sides. It might get dry quite fast as the paper absorbs the water. If there are undesired hard edges, use a clean, damp brush to soften the edges. And keep damping the paper where needed. Use pure Indian yellow to intensify the color of sunlit grass. While damp, adding some dark color for natural transition. As I said earlier, if only wetting one side, the paper dries quite quickly. So re-wet the paper as you go. I'm deepening the shadows again with pure ultramarine blue. This step is only needed if you find certain areas too pale. Now it is time to paint the tree. Picking up some dark colors on the palette. For the trunk, I'm using a synthetic round brush. I'm switching to a rigger for the smaller branches. Now I'm I'm using a natural sponge for the leaves. I have dampened it with clean water and squeezed out excess water, and I'm covering it with paint on all sides. Then I am pressing the sponge on the paper and I turn a little bit here and there so that there are variations in the patterns. It is better to use a natural sponge because its patterns are varied. But before using it in a painting, please test it out. You can use a brush to adjust the shape. The paint should not be too wet. Repeat this process until you achieve the desired effect. Adding some more branches. I'm picking up a bit pure Indian yellow to add some warm bits on the right side of the tree. It is quite subtle as I don't want to draw too much attention there. At this point, we're not introducing any new colors, just using the colors we have been using for color harmony. I'm also adding some shadows under the tree. This is the final result. If you like my painting and a video, please click like and subscribe.